Hi, in this video I wanted to talk a little bit about the history of Reiki and the changes that Reiki has gone through since Usui Sensei discovered or formed what he understood as Reiki into a practice at that time in Japan. So as most of you may know who know something about Reiki, it was Usui Sensei, or as we were taught through Mrs Takata, Dr. Usui, who was the originator of Reiki. And what Dr. Usui, or Usui Sensei, had was discovered through some means, and it's at this point just going to be clear that there is the mythological history of Reiki that has come to the United States and to the West through Mrs Takata, Takata, who was a Japanese Hawaiian person who discovered Reiki through going to a clinic that was run by Dr. Hayashi. So in Mrs Takata's transmission, she understood the lineages coming through Dr. Usui, through Dr. Hayashi, who was a naval doctor in the Japanese Navy, down to Mrs Takata. So when Mrs Takata started to teach Reiki in the 70s in the United States, she felt that because of the history behind World War II, having ended only in the mid-40s, that a lot of Americans were still perhaps prejudiced against Japanese. So what she did is she took a combination of her understanding of what Reiki was, which I'll talk about what her understanding was versus what we've come to discover in recent years. She took a combination of that and certain embellishments that she made on Dr. Usui, or Usui Sensei, biography about his life. So when Mrs Takata, who received this transmission of Reiki, when she started to teach, she added certain things to the story to make it more appealing to Americans. She said that when he was motivated to learn about healing, that he was wanting to know, how did Jesus heal? And that was one of his primary motivations. That's possible, but is certainly almost a very small, if any, part of his motivation. He was not a Christian, at least in terms of a practicing Christian. In fact, his family was Buddhist. And in Japan there's a Tendai Buddhist, Shingon Buddhism. Those both have esoteric inner practices, along with other forms of Buddhism in Japan at the time. So Mrs Takata had said that he wanted to know how Jesus healed, and she also embellished his biography by saying that he went to the University of Chicago, was a Western-trained allopathic medical doctor, which is not true. In fact, if Usui had the title doctor at all, there was some kind of literary certification, a doctor of literature or a recognized person in literature, that was apparently awarded to him by either the government of Japan or a local province, based on he and his clinic's assistance to people after the great earthquake in Japan. So those are some of the stories that Mrs Takata had taught. And since that time, she originally taught 22 Reiki masters, and I believe she charged like $10,000 at the time. And she felt Americans were so into money that they wouldn't appreciate Reiki unless it costs a lot of money. So myself and other Reiki masters, as we've gone through time, have tried to change the economics of Reiki. And in fact, for instance, I teach Reiki Level 1 for free, because I think Reiki is so powerful that the concept of money or people having finances or not having finances shouldn't enter into this experience at all. So let's go back to Usui. What was he doing, or what did he do? Usui was apparently a practitioner of many different kinds of spirituality that were available to him in Japan at the time. He was born in the mid to late 1800s, around 1860s, and at that time Japan had just been opened up after being closed for centuries. Had been an isolated country, was not trading with the rest of the world, and I think it was Commodore Perry and other parts of the United States Navy that basically gave them an ultimatum that you will open up and trade with us. So at that time you had the traditions of Japan, which were now being flooded and influenced by all kinds of other forms of materialism and spirituality and so on. And it was at this time, at the end of the 19th century, that you had the beginnings of this huge influx of Eastern spirituality in general spreading out. And this happened from the end of the 1800s to the early 1900s, etc., through Vivekananda and the different gatherings of universal religion, etc. All of these things were happening. So Usui was in a very fruitful time in Japan's history in terms of spirituality. Among his friends were the founder of Aikido and the founder of other spiritual groups that are very prominent in Japan to this day. So it's not totally clear how Usui discovered Reiki. In Mrs Takata's story, he went to this mountain, decided to fast, had a pile of 21 rocks for each day he was there. He was fasting to the death. Every day he would take a rock and throw it off the cliff, and on the last day when he was just giving up having any breakthrough or any realization, he throws the rock off, and then all of a sudden he has this realization about Reiki and receives some kind of an attunement or initiation from the higher dimensions. We don't know if this story is true, but what is true is that an esoteric religion like Shingon and Tendai Buddhism, and certainly the longer different paths such as the Japanese forms of shamanism, wilderness, vision questing, and even Shinto. I'm sure you've probably seen video or pictures of, Shinto priests who are under a waterfall and they're meditating as the waterfall is hitting them in the crown, on the top of the head. So no doubt Dr. Usui knew of many meditation techniques, many forms of inner cultivation, and at some point, yes, something did happen, and he realized this spiritual energy, Reiki, and began to teach. Now, what did he teach? What was his motivation? Certainly he wanted other people to experience and know what he had, inner peace and inner healing. Now, he set up a dojo where he was the sensei or the master, and he trained people. And if we were to look at Reiki today, we might think, well, he trained people how to do the hands-on healing or distant healing. Certainly this was true, but his setup, from what we can tell, included elements of healing practice, but was not primarily about healing itself. Healing, when we think about Reiki, we tend to think of it as maybe physical healing, maybe some mental or emotional healing, but really what healing is that inner cultivation of reaching the essence of who you are as a human being and a spiritual being. So what Usui was doing was cultivating souls. He was cultivating people through the practices that he knew and the practices that he shared. And we know from some of the things that came through Reiki in the lineages, not from Mrs. Takata, but from other Japanese students, that there were elements that the Reiki lineage had that were from Shintoism, different ceremonies, etc. So Usui, being a very adept, creative, and spiritual person, used those tools in the cultures, in the spiritual traditions that were around him, and picked the best of those that fit into his motivation and what he felt was effective for himself and for his students. So this was going on, And it was really towards the end of Usui's life when Dr. Hayashi comes into the picture. Now, Japan at the time, as part of your inner development, it was considered that you can even be in the military and develop yourself spiritually. So a lot of Usui's students were military officers. They were people in the elite parts of society, very well connected, some of them very spiritually developed, and they became his students. And towards the end of all of Usui's work in Reiki, it was like in the last year or so that this military naval doctor, Dr. Hayashi, encountered Usui and became one of his students. So now we have a shift and a turning in Reiki itself, where Reiki, to me, was primarily a spiritual practice with a healing practicum, or with a set of physical and inner healing supports. Through Dr. Hayashi, he was looking to adapt Reiki into clinical practice. So being a medical doctor, yes, he had the inner cultivation and he did many of the things that Dr. or Usui Sensei had done, but it's through Dr. Hayashi that you have a codified practice. You have the Reiki manuals, healing manuals, practice manuals, technique manuals, all those types of things, so that Reiki could be then taken into a clinical setting and used as an adjunct or a supplement to Western allopathic medicine. So it's going through Dr. Hayashi, a Western trained doctor, that Reiki makes a, I don't want to call it a detour, but sort of an expansion into a more systematized way of being carried out. Now this was the branch of Reiki through Hayashi. There are other Japanese lineages and groups that were practicing in Japan who, Hayashi was not part of. And they were carrying around a different set of practices, etc., than necessarily what Hayashi was doing. So, from Usui to Hayashi, and then we come to Mrs. Takata. And Mrs. Takata was ill in Hawaii. She's a Japanese American, and she decides to go back to Japan. This was before World War II, and she goes to one of the clinics that Dr. Hayashi is running, and the story goes that somebody put her hands on her and it was very hot, and she was very shocked, and she said, like, "What is that? What are you doing?" So that's how she encountered Reiki, and then eventually became a student of Dr. Hayashi's. Alright, so now she goes back to Japan, presumably after she's been trained as a Reiki master. Those details are not so clear at this time, if she went back multiple times or stayed for a long time or what. Anyhow, World War II happens, and as far as Mrs. Takata knows, Reiki has been wiped out. She loses contact with folks. She has no idea what's happened to Reiki. And it's from this viewpoint of an assumption, that Mrs. Takata has this Reiki lineage, and she assumes that she's the only person who has it. And by the late 60s, early 70s, she's feeling this urge, this inner guidance to go ahead and start teaching Reiki. So it's at this point that the history of Reiki becomes sort of molded and shifted to fit into not the original spiritual practice of Usui Sensei with the healing practicum, and not the clinical application of Reiki as from Dr. Hayashi, but what Mrs. Takata does is to sort of inject or carry over this Japanese lineage into the West. And at least the way it has been expressed and certainly accepted a lot by a lot of New Age people, different things like this, different open-minded alternative groups of folks. So in her transmission, because of not knowing all of the things that Usui had been doing, not receiving them in her own training, or if she did, not passing them on to the Reiki students, her 22 Reiki masters. And because of the embellishments behind Dr. Usui's biography, what we had been given was a very cartoon-like history of Reiki itself. So, it's 2015 now, and it's within the last 10 to 15 years that a number of folks have gone back to Japan. We now know of different lineages that survive, different ceremonies that survive from Usui and Hayashi's time. And it's very clear that, certainly we're thankful for the transmission from Mrs. Takata, but it's very clear that she was embellishing a story, and that she didn't necessarily transmit or possibly know a lot of the things that were components in Reiki in the original history. So, besides this history, my motivation when I teach Reiki is not only to be aware of the research and the people who have written or come forward about what they knew, students of Dr. Hayashi, etc. But my motivation is to attempt to transmit the energy and the concept or the field of Reiki as it was when Dr. Usui or Usui Sensei encountered it. Certainly, I teach all of the standard stuff at Reiki Level 1, Reiki 2, and Reiki Master. But in addition to the techniques and the symbols or whatever, we also practice many things that were part of the original Reiki that did not come through Mrs. Takata. There are certain ceremonies, there are sacred sounds, Reiki Koto Dama, different things. So what I try to give my students is an impression or the energy of that original transmission. What is it? And what I've come to realize that it's very much a transmission of compassion. What Reiki is a compassionate vehicle, a compassionate transmission that was incubated in the social environment of Japan, which is a very socially cohesive environment. And even though, outwardly people are very polite, there's not a lot of touching, maintaining this outer distance, but there's a lot of inner cultivation. And there's a lot of heart connection in Japanese culture, really, once you get below the surface. So, what Usui had tapped into was this stream of compassion. So many people have said or felt that, there are resonances to Tara or Kuan Yin or whatever, and to a certain extent you could even consider that Dr. Usui or Usui Sensei was either a bodhisattva or on the path of becoming a bodhisattva. Somebody who just had a gift, had a way of expressing healing, peace, joy, and wanted to teach that, wanted to spread that. And besides the social and cultural incubator of Japan, Buddhism itself. Buddhism was a very core transmission or nucleus to the Reiki experience. Just the viewpoint of being able to go within, to look for answers within. This is a very Buddhist concept. To let the truth be recognized through meditation and reflection, and then putting that into practice by giving, by supporting, nourishing yourself and other people and in your relationships. But also this sense of raising vibration and raising awareness to truth and inner awareness, along with the practices. It's very clear to me, having been a Reiki master since 2003, having studied Reiki since 1999, that Usui was all about a spiritual practice, and it came to a point where it was granted an expression to bring others in. So besides all the inner practices, it's an inner path. Certainly it's an exoteric path, and by that I mean truth is not discovered primarily from reading what other people have written about their own spiritual experiences, but it's primarily about you having your own spiritual experiences. And the fact that in a Reiki attunement there is the use of touch, breath. These are common elements in an esoteric school where the vibration of the master or the teacher is used through touch and through breath and glance to help awaken the vibration that's already in the student, but to strengthen it and awaken it to the point where the student can then make progress on their spiritual journey, make progress on their inner realizations, and learn how to enter and be a vehicle of service themselves. So I think this fuller picture of Reiki as a spiritual modality, this is what has not been brought out or strengthened or emphasized clearly enough in the transmission as it came down through Hayashi and Mrs Takata from Usui Sensei. And I think there are more Reiki masters now who are tuning into this, who are looking at it as being, you know, it's not a New Age thing, it's not just an alternative thing, it's a real thing. It's a path of compassion and a path of healing. So I wanted to share that in this video, that the sphere of Reiki is wider than we had from Mrs Takata in her teaching, in her stories. We're certainly thankful for her transmission, or else we would not be talking about Reiki today in the West right now. All right, thank you.